Welcome to the fourth virtual workshop of the BAFA Accounting History Special Interest Group, 20th of April 2021.
Well, a very good morning to you all and a warm welcome, and thank you for joining us today at the fourth BAFA Special Interest Group on Accounting History virtual workshop. It's lovely to see you all here. My name's Alistair Doby. We have got three very interesting papers this morning, which will take us across the globe, starting off in China, moving to the United States, and ending up in present-day Sri Lanka. Well, I think Ancient Ceylon is the title of the paper. So our speakers today, speaking on the Chinese accounting profession in the People's Republic, we have, now I do apologize for my pronunciation, Qingmei Zhu and Luca Zhan from the universities of Nanjing in China and Bologna in Italy. Secondly, we've got Martin Pearson speaking on the American Institute of Accountants Aptitude Testing experiment, which sounds quite fascinating. And Martin is from Illinois University. And thirdly, we have Supan Chandrasena from Trinity College Dublin, who will be telling us about accounting in Ancient Ceylon. We'll follow the usual format. We have allowed 25 minutes for presentation, then 5 minutes for the discussants, and then 5 minutes for question and answer. I know once you start sharing screen, it's a bit difficult to see what the time is, but I shall try and give you a prompt maybe about 5 minutes before the end of your talk, just to let you know how time is going. Is there anything else I need to say, Alan or Karen or Matt, at this stage?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, that's great. Okay, well, we will kick straight off. We are a couple of minutes early, but that's absolutely fine. So our first speakers this morning, a very warm welcome to Qingmei Zhu and Luca Zhan, who are going to be speaking on the Chinese accounting profession in the People's Republic, looking at oral history. Okay, so if I can hand over to Qingmei and Luca, please.
Okay, we are sharing the presentation. I'm starting, and then Qingmei will go on back to me. So thanks for being here. Thanks for this opportunity. This is a very long paper, the long research. And let me just move this. The Chinese accounting profession, a preliminary understanding from an oral history perspective. So this is more or less the structure of the paper. And the motivation for such a paper, I mean, everybody knows China, the epochal transformation since 1978, with huge impacts on everything, social, economic, political, and also including accounting, of course. And there is an emerging literature in the last years, including a couple of very brilliant papers by Zhan and Xue and Zhan. But even to our own papers, there is something which is missing if we want really to understand the Chinese accounting becoming what it was not. And this is really the need to understand the change of a long period. I mean, there's been a century of continuous discontinuity in China. And even from an accounting point of view, rather than focusing on this particular period, on that particular period, the need, in our understanding, is the need to look at the overall process or long-term process of transformation. And the second and even more important point is the kind of missing element in the literature, even including myself. So it's really the accounting profession. There's so little written about the accounting profession, and also kind of a very passive kind of attitude, in a sense, what is decided by the top is acted, enacted, or implemented without any unanticipated consequences, which is strange, particularly in a country where you're talking about millions of accountants. In 1986, about 6.9 million of accounting. Nowadays, 20 million. It's 1/3 of Italy of accountants. How can you manage such a community of professionals? So we are, one of the problems when you do this kind of paper is to what extent you want to explain to the reader or what you take for granted, in the sense, if we start explaining the transformation of China, that will take 2 books more than a paper on its own. So you always have to leave something, assuming that the reader is familiar with. So this is something we are not going to explain much in the paper, nor today, but just focusing on major period of discontinuity starting from the People's Republic. So there are 3 main literatures we refer to. One is, in a sense, a general miscellaneous, talking about transformation in China in the last 30 years from an accounting point of view. Yeah, many of different topics. And two specific literature perhaps are particularly relevant to us. One is accounting and ideology, particularly a few papers on China, in particular Isabel et al. 2007, and the other on hegemony, which once again, a couple of papers on China in particular. So in the paper, not here now, we are in a sense trying to give an account on these contributions, but the main point is the kind of literary gap I was referring to, the lack of focus on the profession, and with the few, even if the discussion on accountants is not really a major focus, even when in other contribution, there's a very VIP bias, I would say, which is involving influential individuals, even in the Isabel et al. Research, or those who had a significant role. So you're just looking at important person to understand the transformation of accounting. We are doing something different with oral history, and oral history is a wonderful, I mean, we never had experience before, and so that was really a very fascinating field to look at. Very complex debate, rarely used in accounting, with possible puzzling when you have variations and inconsistency. From a very general point of view, there's this movement, it's a kind of political movement that is calling for a view from below. And this is really something that really sums up really well, particularly in the field of history, not maybe in our field, but most of the time the bias of looking at documents or sources that really just the official. One, the idea is looking from below, from those that normally has no voice, or putting Bob Dylan here, the lackness, the abandonment, and forsake the chimes of freedom. This is a wonderful exhibition by Dorothy Lange, Politics of Scenes during the Great Depression, which was one of the environment, and Dorothy herself was considered part of the oral history original movement. In accounting, there's a kind of debate between moderate and radical positions, if we are allowed to use this expression, in two particular senses. One is real societal, which one is arguing, calling for a view from below, strictly speaking, Hamann and Sika, for instance, but also there are someone that are also taking into account the voice from very important people. So this societal debate, in a sense, and from another issue that is discussed is in terms of epistemological assumptions, with the debate between constructivist versus positivist, or non-positivist versus positivist, and once again, the Collins and Brown talking about truth, and Hamann and Sicken has a more pluralist, or if not relativist view. When you're talking about China, that's completely even more puzzling, because of what is below. If the below according to a strict Marxist class struggle rules. I mean, if workers take the power, now the top is the below. So you're talking in the name of those that were below, but now are part of the regime. And that could be very, very controversial, particularly if you ignore totally the process of political and social stratification that are associated with the new structure of power. And of course, China, with one of the worst Gini index, is now one of the most unequal country in the world, and also particularly on oral history, the way in which the regime was using oral history during the Cultural Revolution as a technology of power, as someone referred to, is something very puzzling to in this context of what is the below. It's below from a normal sociological stratification or from a very classical Marxist structure. So I give the floor to Jimei. There's so just one thing. There's just one project, and we will come back later on oral history in accounting in China. So Jimei, I can move the slide as you want.
All right. So what we did is that to interview some retired accountants. I find 21 retired accountants from personal contacts. They are mostly normal accountants, but we also have 2 from Ministry of Finance. Therefore, we have a mixed group of interviewees. So I interviewed them, but this is not a traditional field study interview because I do not have specific research question. My focus is to collect information about their individual life experience for their accounting profession. So the interview is anonymous and it took on average 2 hours. All the interviews are taped and transcribed. Then I translate the transcription into English. Luca and I, we analyzed the transcription. This table is just a summary of these interviewees. In next slides, please. Oh, sorry, the other slides, not this one. Anyway, it's okay. So we analyzed these narratives and 7, yes, this one. We summarized this transcriptions into this big table, and you can see there are 4 periods. Next slides, please. So we analyzed the narratives and 7 major areas emerged from these narratives. Then I will explain this one by one. I will just show you their original words from these slides. This is the first one. For example, they told us the image of poverty. You will laugh at me. Went to middle school only half a year. I never saw a new light until 1948. This is from the 3rd interviewee. It was very poor at the time. Next slide, please. About the accounting education, they told us how they were educated. At the beginning, they said I went to evening school. That's in 1950s. And impact of the Cultural Revolution, it's number 11. He told us about university education. He said no universities or college accepted students. They were all closed. They were not closed. The universities were still there. They just did not accept any new students until after the Cultural Revolution. Then I asked, what are they doing then? They said they were doing the revolution. Everyone in university was involved. That was what they were doing at the time. So next slide, please. I also asked the accountants how they come to their this accounting profession at the beginning. Most of them, they said they do not have a choice at the time. For example, the 13 said, I was assigned a job after graduation. So it was not a choice, a personal choice. And the political factor and economic factor impact their choice. For example, the first one, number 2, the interviewee number 2 says, in 1959, the cadres were dispatched to do labor work, so I was sent to the factory too. At that time, he was already an accountant, but because of the political movement, he has to do some labor work. And after economic reform, they had the opportunity to change. For example, employee number 4 said, why did I change to school? It was already 1979. He was an accountant. Then he got the opportunity to become a school teacher to teach accounting. Next slide, please. The political factors also impact their career for the long term. For example, after the economic reform, they had the opportunity to get some senior titles, get some CPA certificate. And the interesting thing is that they all take a second job. For example, after retirement, for example, number 1 said in 1986, after I retired, I took a second job. All the others are similar. And we also observed the pattern that they all worked for the same company for their whole life. For example, number 7 said, I did the same work for 23 years. This is very interesting. And next slides. And the Cultural Revolution had an impact on accounting, but different interviewees make these different descriptions. For example, the number 10 says, whatever the situation was, we had to work as usual. And the others that sometimes we have to learn chairman mouse words in the daytime and also in the evening. And another interesting thing is made by interviewee 7 said, he said, I used to work in a big state-owned company, which had a very good internal management system. I used my experience from the big company to manage a small company. This is after economic reform. He got a second job after retirement. Okay, next slide, please. The accounting status has been changing. At the beginning, in 1950s, you can see the government needed a lot of cadres at the beginning, but later, especially during Cultural Revolution, the thing has changed a lot. For example, number 21 says, accounting is work that anyone can do without any training. After economic reform, things are changing. Next slide, please. About the accounting knowledge, a Chinese bookkeeping system was invented called increase-decrease method. Many of our interviewees mentioned this method. Some says this is increase-decrease method was easy to learn and understand. So debit-credit was capitalism and the increase-decrease was socialism. The other says it is not a useful method. Some academics also told us some negative opinions about positive accounting research. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, so I'm gonna discuss a little bit about what we have found for these 7 major areas. From the general context, we can see that as professional elite, the Chinese accounting profession, the all involved in this general context, the poverty, the violence in this Cultural Revolution. This is very different from the accounting profession in other countries. This is very unique, and their career all impacted by the economic reform. They have been directly involved in the market economy development. For example, the we call 事业单位, which is the public service unit, the development of these SOE, state-owned enterprises, etc. For accounting education, at the beginning, most of the accountants, they were lack of accounting knowledge. They can only get very limited knowledge background. Later on, they got some on-the-job training, but the education was totally interrupted by Cultural Revolution. And after the economic reform, there were more on-the-job training and things got better. At the beginning of their profession, as I said, they were allocated to the job. They didn't have a personal choice. But because of Cultural Revolution and great leap forward, those political movements, their career were all delayed, and until the economic reform. The political impact also has an impact on their long-term career. It's very interesting because some accountants, they leave this accounting profession because of the Cultural Revolution, and some, they actually enter this profession. So we have a flexible boundary. We got a profile. Yes, this one. Yeah, please. We draw up does it work? Yes, this is a simplified form of their profiles to show their vertical and the horizontal development of their life career. Please go back. Most of them had a lifelong job, as I said, and most of them took a second job after retirement. Accounting work is, at the beginning of the Republic, the accounting is a very simpler form, and they took the Soviet model. But after Cultural Revolution, accounting has been even more simplified, which make it possible for those people who has limited background come to this profession. According to our interviewees, some believe Cultural Revolution had a major impact in accounting, but others believe, okay, it's because it's army or because their specific nature of the industry, their work hasn't been impacted a lot by Cultural Revolution. Then the last one is about accounting status. At the beginning of, from beginning of the Republic to Cultural Revolution, accounting wasn't considered as important. But after the Cultural Revolution, when the economic reform started, the accounting has become more and more important. So Luca, maybe you can move on.
Yes, that's some issue in terms of understanding what accounting is. And what is really interesting in our interviews, we have a lot of disagreements. People disagree about, for instance, the CRIS method. And one of our reviewers say, who is right? You know, who knows? You know, that's oral history. Unless you are asking one very specific point, you can double check. That's an issue of interpretation, what people perceive, what people think it is. It's not our job to go back and just double check who's right, who's wrong. And what is interesting to catch there's a lot of debate about the Americanization of research and talking about again money. What is really interesting to see is Chimay is using a journal ranking and her university, her university using a ranking system, which is exactly mainstream ABS or something similar that is used in the state. What is really interesting is some of the, you know, it's not statistically, we're interviewing 21% out of 1.4 billion, but we are just trying to use oral history to grasp information issues that we can decide. And there is really, this issue of what one of the referees was using, what we would say the bloody proprietary view in accounting. So accounting, just, you know, the nature of accounting, that's shareholder equity in the main focus, which challenges is accounting faced with during this period. The goals are all based on shareholders' rights and interests, which is, you know, forgetting completely all the debate of the nature of the firm and accounting, not just in political terms, but also in theoretical terms, in terms of proprietary and entity theory, in terms of participation, in terms from the shift from stockholders to stakeholders. There's nothing of this kind, just this radical, I would say, reactionary theoretical premise or result of the gradual revolution. You know, where all the debate over a century is forgot simply. And of course, this is one person, but this is interesting as a research question for the future. So basically, this is very, you know, the kind of paper is very difficult to sum up because we can simply look at what's the last two slides. So what we understand, or we leave the interview speak, and this is what we do. So a long paper, long collection of words by our interviewees, but a very, what I think it's a very important implication for research, which is really the very unusual context of professional education, the intrusive role of the Communist Party with top-down efforts from a very long period and consistently, I would say, and the development of the liberal profession in a no-liberal context, which is once again linked to a strange political experiment of market economy without democracy, and a profession without a liberal market for a long period, with these huge numbers of people that were not choosing anything, neither education nor job. With the Cultural Revolution, what emerged is more controversial, which is simply stated in the literature. Accounting stopped. It's not that simple, but yeah, this is still a sensitive topic. So what I think, again, the main point emerging is the kind of confusion and controversy that you find in talking with people, unclear things that from a topic could be very clear. So I think that the risk of having kind of, you know, the idea of that of the unlimited rationality, you know, Herbert Simon and the Communist Party is the paper, the subtitle of the paper. Even if the Communist Party knows what he wants to do, I mean, what really happened in the end is not that easy. What is they're anticipating emerging issues, partial ignorance, local adjustment, not resistance in a political sense, but simply getting things different from what they were defined at the top. And the profession, that's an important thing. It's just not just a monolithic entity. And all the debate that we found is about the elite of the profession and the party. But when the elite has to deal with millions of people, that's something, that's room for different kind of research. What is interesting, very quickly, on the only example of oral history is now available in China, in Chinese, what very different from us. I mean, the people that were selected were those who made a pioneering achievement in a specific aspect of accounting. So still a VIP view. The method is finding this predecessor, listing the stories of the past, recording, editing, reserving, publishing the stories without commenting and without making point, you know, or discussing it. And epistemology, once again, kind of positivism, to try our best to get close to the truth, which is a word that is difficult to use for me. So this conclusion, and then the conclusion, we move trying to make an order in the debate about the different views about oral history back to the general debate. And this is a kind of matrix typology that we can design. Here we need to put a kind of question mark zoom, because not always is that clear. So, but this is kind of positive way to map the differences. And you see what is interesting, the Chinese debate is here. You know, it's biased by positivism, and most of the time from the top down view. Our paper is here, and I'm going to finish very soon in two seconds. This is where our epistemological preferences in political, if you want, are here, but in the sense of China, you know, whatever it comes, it's okay. You know, the understanding China is so complicated that we have VIP in the panel. It's okay. Also because VIP have not been, they were not born as VIP, so they were young, so they were in the early stage of their career, they were normal accountants. So we can understand also from this. So we are not radically from this point of view, from the point of view of below and above. We have two very important persons, and we have 3 or 4 other persons that could be defined as VIPs. Our referees are objecting that we are against VIP. That is not the point, as we don't want to say on this base. So it is also because of the two aspects. One is the substantive element in the Chinese society, in the Chinese way of working and organizing, and also from an epistemological point of view. We simply want to voice the thousands, the millions. That's it, more or less. A long paper made short.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Luca and Qingmei. Now, for the next 5 minutes, can I invite the discussant, Tagisha Sagita, to speak?
Yes, thanks so much, and thank you very much, Luca and Qingmei. So, thank you very much for telling us about Chinese accounting professions. Your presentation was very clear and very interesting. Even though I'm not familiar with oral history and the Chinese auditing and accounting. So I'd like to describe some comments and suggestions for you guys. First of all, your research question and methodology are really clear and so interesting for me. In general, accountants in China, professional system may be unfamiliar for Western academic society, including Japanese society too. So I am so interested in your effort to clarify them. I also recognize that this is a very specific case, and I would say that it's been not focused in Western academic society so far. Of course, you already survey a lot of literature in this paper. So it seems to be good opportunity for me to catch up and understand Chinese accounting profession during cultural revolution, those terms. On the cultural revolution, is it correct? So, on the other hand, originally, I do not know and understand the systematic accounting system and audit system in China during those times. So it's if this paper had given me a little more information regarding those systems, I could have understood a little more for your research essential and implication too. I mean, it would be easier for me to understand the differences from the accounting profession in Western Europe, which we generally understand the history of auditing and accounting system in common. Of course, the development of Chinese corporation or joint stock company system was very different from that of Western society. So, as I said, if you had provide knowledge and information of auditing and accounting circumstances and what the differences between Western and Chinese, we would be able to understand your research, especially interviews in more depth. So I'm going to focus on research method and your interviews. So the methodology is very interesting, as I said, and I think it was a good one because this paper has a lot of samples. Moreover, I feel that oral history is becoming more important for historical research, even though I'm not familiar with oral history. And then this paper already conducted interviews with 21 accountants, and the sample size appeared to be enough for oral history research. And I would say that is such a laborious and different interview for your paper. So and then you focus on life experience. So that's why so valuable and so useful interview, I would say. However, since I do not know the requirements for accountant qualification in each era, such as during Cultural Revolution, so little bit it's difficult for me to understand the skills, duties required of accountants in each era. By presenting the essence of the contents of the interview a little more clearly, it would be easier for me to understand the points of your presentation. If possible, I wanted to know outline of the accountant and the regulation of auditing in terms of profession. In general, we do not generally understand the process of qualifying a Chinese profession and the significance of an accountant's presence in Chinese society, even in the present day. According to my understanding, basically the six requirements that make up a profession are, for example, occupation, calling, organization, education, service, autonomy. So from this point of view, it would be easy for me to identify and organize accounting profession in China. It will help me to understand what kind of organizational system, skills, and knowledge they have. For instance, if possible, please confirm this question at the next term. What professional qualification and training is required or available to follow a career in accounting during the period of the Cultural Revolution. Anyway, so I'd like to summarize my talks. I think that your paper, logical expansion and the methodology of your paper must be so good. As I told you, so interesting and so curious for me. In addition, as a methodology and oral history must be such a good way to consider and reveal development of Chinese professional status at those times. But basically, we haven't shared knowledge and information about Chinese accounting and auditing regulation as a background. So I would like to recommend to you to describe in a little more detail what kind of system, especially auditing and accountant and accounting and accountant was in China at those time, because the background such as regime and regulation and the corporation system, etc., were quite different from that of Western society during the Cultural Revolution and after that too. So if you'd like, please give us more details regarding accounting and audit information during those times, if possible. I suppose that it should be possible to make up for the gap with me by pointing out what is different from concept of accountants we've shared. Furthermore, if you consider and give us a requirement for accountant and the role of an accountant and the requirement of auditing during that time, those time, we will be able to more clearly recognize the position of accounting profession in China. As a result, in my opinion, it would be more useful for your paper to clarify the regulation and responsibility of an accountant as a profession and refine the content of the interview. Of course, I look forward to progress of your research in the future. And then I would like to thank you for your presentation and your work. Again, so I'd like to tell you, your paper is really fantastic research and oral history research. So thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you very much, Tagisha, for those detailed comments there. Now we've just got a couple of minutes left for general question and answer session. I wondered if there was anything at all that King Mei and Luca wanted to respond to in terms of Takisha's comments to start with. Was there anything you wanted to pick up there? And then I'll invite any general questions or observations.
Very quickly, we have already 2 papers on that, and there are so many other papers. You cannot ask one paper to tell all these things. This is the basic that you have to before reading the paper on oral history. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Any other thoughts or observations or questions? I mean, it was a huge topic, and it just makes you realize how different experience of being accountant is in different regions and different periods compared to what we used to. Any thoughts, questions at all from anybody else?
Martin got his hand up, Alistair, and so has Richard.
Richard, I can see. Sorry, who did you say? Shall I go for Richard first? Because you're on I can see you on the screen there. There we are. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Ching Mei and Luca. And I'm so glad you've done it, because a lot of these people will be dead soon. And the things have changed so fast in China that the young people know nothing about what happened even 10 years ago. So that capturing this is really fascinating. And just from experience, I mean, we interviewed a lot of people, some of whom remembered the Cultural Revolution and how life has changed unbelievably since then. The thing I thought was missing was anything about the international developments, because a lot of the way in which the modern Chinese profession is structured and the accounting is structured is IFRS derived. So the way they think is, well, you have to think like that because the party says so. And the other thing you touched on, which I think is very difficult for anybody who isn't Chinese to understand, is the role of the party. I understand now auditors are expected, when they go on an audit, to have a Communist Party badge in their lapel. There's a Communist Party secretary in every unit of organization. So just imagine here, if when you went out on an audit, you had to have a Conservative Party badge in your lapel, and there was a member of the Conservative Party monitoring everything that was going on in your office. It's just a different world to us. And I think one of the difficulties, certainly in some of the literature, applying people like Bourdieu and Foucault, these are critiques of liberal democracies and the hidden forces underneath. Do they apply to the Chinese political structure? That's enough, but brilliant to have done it. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Richard. I think that's given us all a lot to think about. I'm just aware of time, and we should be starting the next paper in about 2 minutes. I wonder if I could just invite Martin next to, because he has had his hand up for a long time. Apologies, Martin. I was on a different screen and didn't see it.
Well, I actually took it down because I felt it was a bit rude to have a comment and a presentation. But it occurred to me.
Give a presentation, Martin, that's fine.
I have a very short comment, and it's one of those, this is the paper I would have written, so you can just ignore it if it makes no sense at all. But I was struck by the discussion slide. There was one point, I think it was point number 4, that said that at one point there was millions of people in the profession, and yet there was very little work. Of course, there is a story here, of course, I understand with sort of big picture, what's happening in the country, but there's also a profession story here. And in fact, this itself is a bit of a paradox if you believe in the sociology profession, right? Because a lot of these writers say that, well, to have a profession is defined by the work that we do. So if there's no work, how could we possibly have a profession? Yeah. So I think there's a different story here, if you wish, so an Abbott's or system profession story. And of course, that one would not pick up so much maybe on the big sort of political parts, but it could pick up on things like, okay, well, when did we have a first national organization? When did we get an academic organization? When did we get the first degree program at university? And I suspect that if you were to pick up on some of those threads that we see when we think about a profession, they might map quite nicely to the experiences of the individuals you interviewed. And I assume there's just so much more data there than what's, even in the presentation, which was a lot to begin with. So anyways, I'll just leave it at that. It's just a potential angle and something to sort of create a problem up front if you wish. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Martin. Luca and Jing-Mei, I'm going to be very rude here because of time. We could perhaps carry this conversation on after 11 o'clock, but I don't want to run behind in terms of the next presentations. Could I just thank you both very much indeed for an absolutely fascinating presentation. I mean, it's just a completely different world. And also you're doing, it's a completely different way of doing research compared to what a lot of us are doing. And it's really refreshing to hear about it. So thank you very much indeed. If we could just show our applause. Thank you, everyone. That would be great. Thank you very much, Luca and Jing-Mei. Very much appreciated. Okay, right. Keeping to time now, we are moving on to our second presentation. Which again, we've got 25 minutes for. It is Martin Pearson, who's just been speaking from Illinois University. His topic is the American Institute of Accountants Aptitude Testing Experiment in the 1940s. Which sounds absolutely fascinating. Martin, I will send you a little private message when you've got about 5 minutes left to go. If that.
Okay, will that show up? Okay. If not, just rudely interrupt me. I'm used to getting.
Are you sure? I'm not very good at being rude, or maybe I am. I don't think you'll have to let me know.
Oh, you do what you have to. If I'm gonna go ahead and share a very short video as well. if for some reason that audio doesn't work, someone has to say something, because I won't know otherwise. I'm just going to stand there for 3 minutes. So someone just has to interrupt me and say, hey, video's not working, and I'll just talk instead. Thank you so much for having me. So the name of this paper is the American Institute of Accountants Aptitude Testing Experiment in the 1940s, an initiative to increase the supply of able accountants. And yeah, my name is Martin Pearson. I'm a assistant professor still at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, but I have a British connection in that I did my doctoral studies in the UK, and you know, if I had mustered a job, I'm sure I still would have been there. So I'm very happy to be here. It's a little bit late here, but I'm very happy to be here. I'm very excited to present this paper, which is a working paper. I have a few things I hope to get to. I have a video, which I hope will work. And I'll say something about my archive, my theoretical framework, my historical narrative, and some tentative thoughts about what I think this narrative is trying to do, or what I'm trying to do. But I guess before I even jump into this, the big picture of this paper is this. In the 1940s, the American Institute of Accountants, which becomes the AICPA later on, has an initiative by the Committee on the Selection of Personnel. The AICPA solved problems by forming committees by its members, and then they address, you know, whatever the Institute wants them to address. In the 1940s, there was a committee that tried to develop aptitude testing for accounting. We don't have aptitude testing today, right? But we do in some fields, but we don't do in accounting. So when I think about aptitude tests, you can think about the LSAT, for instance, to get into law school, or the GRE or the GMAT to get into graduate school. So there was an attempt in the 1940s to develop something like that for accounting that picks up not on your accounting knowledge necessarily, but rather whether you have the right characteristics to be an accountant, you know, whatever that is. So what I want to start with is a video that was recorded for the AICPA, and it's about 3 minutes long. And it was by a professor at Iowa State College, which is Iowa State University now. And it talks about the aptitude and trying to get the right individuals to choose accounting. And I think it gives a better sense of the period than I can do. And then I get into my paper. Play the video now. Does that work?
Your life work.
It's a wonderful video, and it's about aptitude testing. And it's you know, the language is a bit archaic, but essentially it's trying to encourage people to have the right aptitudes to self-select into accounting and the accounting profession. And it talks about the merits of pursuing accounting. So let me talk a little bit about my archive instead. So most of this work is based in the A.C. Littleton papers, which is at my university. It's in this, I have this little picture here of an underground library, and most of the collection is in there. It's a striking library because it's sort of raised into the ground. So I like the picture, but other than that, so most of it is based on the A.C. Littleton papers. And the way that the AICPA conducts business through committees, most of that material is not saved. So the reason I have the material is because A.C. Littleton, who was a professor at the University of Illinois, was a member. He was the only academic member of this committee. And that's how I know about the activities of the committee. There's also some material coming from the University of Mississippi. The Institute, of course, published the Certified Public Accountant, which sort of kept track on the activities of the institutes. I got those through Mississippi. There's some material from the SEC Historical Society. And then I've drawn on some published literature. So I have 2 books. They're both called The Rise of the Accounting Profession, but they have different subtitles. And they're by John Kerry, who's remains the longest serving secretary of the Institute. And he wrote 2 books that sort of capture the official story of the Institute and its activities. So I relied on that. And so the final piece of data drawn is the American Association of Public Accountants, which is the predecessor of the Institute. And Norman Webster wrote a book that was published in the 50s that sort of captures some of those activities. So that's the material for the paper. In terms of what I'm trying to do, and again, it's a shame that I can't show you, maybe this will work. Oh yeah, this will work. So most of my work draws on sociology of profession. And I don't have time to really get into that here, but I picked this picture, which this is a farmer's philosophy in death. And it's great because it's over 200 years old, and it's in the British Museum. I don't think it's in an exhibit, but it's in there. And it shows this sort of curious nature of professions, that professions has always sort of been with us, right? So here we have the farmer who's preparing for death, and there's also the professionals. There's the vicar and the lawyer drawing up a testament. There's also the farmer's doctor and so forth, right? So this sort of presence of profession throughout society, and that's what I'm curious about. And of course, I'm interested in the accounting profession. Very broadly, you know, there's two big streams, right? There's sort of the Larson professionalization stream, which talks about things like establishing barriers to entry in order to have a profession, right? That in order to have a profession, we have to have some form of exclusion, right? We're going to make sure that some people are not members and some are members. So there's a lot of that stuff. And then there's the sort of the system of profession literature, which talks about if you're interested in the profession, really you need to study the profession's work, right? And if you're interested in sort of how professions advance and become bigger and smaller, you really need to see how they compete for work with other professions. And that's the system of professions literature. And that's sort of where I'm at with this paper. And I'll say up front, I'll say this, most of the pushback that I've had here at Illinois is on my use of the system of professions. So the way that that's been used in accounting mostly is to talk about competition for areas of work. So there's papers on, you know, who should do sustainability audit? Should it be an accountant, or should it be someone that knows something about the environment or something else? So there's a lot of papers there in accounting where professions are sort of competing for work. In this paper, there's no competition for work. I use Abbott to talk about different professions and how ideas travel between those professions. So in this paper, the accountants at the Institute adopt methods from educational psychology to develop aptitude testing in accounting. So they're not competing with educational psychologists for the aptitude work. And I think that's where the major pushback has been on this paper, because I have had several individuals who feel like that's not a true sort of professionalization story. I disagree, but that's sort of where that's coming from. Now, let me see what I got here, since I was fiddling around. Okay, I still have plenty of time. So I'm going to give you a little bit of my narrative. I start with this picture of this is, of course, the 1929. This is the market crash. This is outside of Wall Street. And I'm going to give you just sort of the rise of the profession, and then we get into the committee. So very broadly, we got sort of 1887, we get the American Association of Public Accountants, the AAPA, and that's sort of the first national organization for accountants in the United States. And then that becomes the American Institute of Accountants in 1916. And then, of course, it becomes the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants in 1957. This narrative is while the organization is still the American Institute of Accountants in the 1940s. So that's sort of where we are. This picture, of course, we got the great crash that leads to the creation of the SEC in 1934. And then the SEC delegates the Senate setting rights to the Institute, and they keep that until the creation of the Financial Accounting Standards Board in 1973. So when you think about this, I have Alvin Jennings, one of the presidents of the Institute during this period, creates the Accounting Research Division, Accounting Principal Board, that then go ahead and issue sort of accounting standards for a while before the FASB takes over. So the reason I bring this up is just because so thinking about Abbott's writings about profession and so forth, the way I portrayed this in the paper is a period of sort of rising strength of the profession, right? Where they organize nationally, and they sort of, for a period of time, even have the standard setting sort of process in a private organization that represents the profession, right? So we're in this sort of period of sort of increased significance of the accounting profession. And that's sort of the backdrop of my narrative. So what about the Committee on Personnel? This is the best picture I could find. This is not a very good picture, but you know, that's what we got. So in the 1940s, we have a shortage of accountants, and it's partially due to increased barriers to entry in terms of sitting for the CPA exam and so forth. There's also sort of a relative greater esteem of neighboring professions. So if you're very, very good, you're probably self-selecting out of accounting, and maybe you pursue law or medicine or something else. And then there's the demands of the war effort, right? Where frankly, a lot of young men are preparing for war. So in 1944, the Institute established a committee to improve the selection of professional accounting personnel and devise measures and procedures to show the extent to which an individual possesses personal qualities and technical abilities indicating successful career in accountancy. So this is the original sort of goal of the committee, to sort of try and find if we can identify the personal qualities that will make you a good accountant. And if we can, then maybe we can entice you to join the accounting profession. That's sort of the idea. do I want to say anything about the members? Warren Neasley is an interesting character. He's the chair. He died suddenly of a heart attack in 1950. He's an accountant in New York City. There's another 4 New York City-based accountants, and then A.C. Littleton from the University of Illinois. So that's sort of the group. It's very sort of New York focused. Most of the money that they raise for the project comes from firms in New York City. There's no member outside of New York, so other than A.C. Littleton, who's the only academic. So it's very much a New York affair. And in the paper, I sort of pick apart this using the 3 stages of professional work. So we got diagnosis, inference, and treatment. So I talk about how the accountants are sort of diagnosing this problem of a shortage. And they looked around in other professions, and they look at the beta and alpha tests that were used in the Army as early, I think, as the 1920s, to recruit individuals that didn't have the actual qualifications to join. And then, of course, they come up with the treatment, which is to develop an aptitude test of their own. And the paper also talks a little bit about professional dominance. Abbott has this thing about a profession being, there's groups within the profession that tends to dominate the profession. And the way I argue that's happening in accounting in the United States in this period, in the 1940s, is that the professional activities of the Institute are dominated by a group of accountants in New York City. And of course, the Institute's headquarters is also in New York City. So it's very much sort of a New York type of affair, whereas accountants in Alabama do not have the same concerns as the accountants in New York. So the committee, sort of having identified that they want to do aptitude testing, reached out to the Education Records Bureau. And at this bureau, we got Ben D. Wood, who's an adjunct at Columbia University and director of the bureau. And he's hired by the committee to develop aptitude tests in accounting. And he develops with the committee 3 such tests. There's an achievement test, which I have all the tests and so forth. My take on that test is that it's sort of testing general business knowledge and a little bit of accounting, but not to the point where you have to do like entries. Then there's an orientation test, which is sort of trying to get at, do you have the qualities that would make a good accountant? So do you like numbers and so forth? That's simplifying it, but it's trying to get at those. And then there's the vocational interest test. And the vocational interest test is based on some research that was done at Stanford at the time, but it's interview based. It's basically saying, well, jobs have certain characteristics. And if you share those characteristics and you're self-selecting to work that sort of fits those characteristics, you will be happier on average. You know, whether that's true or not, but those are the sort of the 3 tests that are being developed. And again, this comes back to my use of Abbott. You know, I am not claiming that Wood is competing with the accountants for the work of doing aptitude testing. He's actually hired, and the methods come from educational psychology. And I use sort of Abbott to sort of show how these sort of transfer from one jurisdiction to another. And that's where I have most of the pushback. I also have something in the paper about the sort of queer nature of the professional controls when it comes to aptitude testing, because the accountants want to recruit what they see, what they believe are going to be sort of good professionals, but at the same time, they don't want to lower their standards to entry, right? So they're sort of trying to identify these sort of would-be good accountants and get them into the profession. So it is a professional control, but it's unlike most of sort of content-based controls, right? Which are sort of methods mainly of exclusion. So I think that's interesting. It's something I try to pick apart in the paper. So where does the university come in? So this is the University of Illinois. So here's a quote from Wood. The committee recognized the importance of universities to the administration of aptitude tests from the onset, and therefore adopted and acted on the hypothesis that the success of the project would depend definitely on the extent to which full and free cooperation with the colleges could be secured. And there's a passage in the paper where I talk about, you know, why did they pick A.C. Littleton and the University of Illinois? Out of all the members they could have picked, why did they pick the University of Illinois? Well, in the 1940s, the University of Illinois would have been sort of at the forefront of accounting education. So Littleton was the president of the American Accounting Association for something like 8 years. He was the editor of the Accounting Review. And the first PhD program in accounting originated at the University of Illinois. So he was very much sort of the most scholarly man in accounting at the time. And I think that's why they reached out to him. And I won't get into it here, but the paper talks a little bit about how actually Littleton had been exploring aptitude testing. And he had been following developments in the Army and in the Air Force specifically, and their use of aptitude tests. So there's a bit of serendipity here where the Institute is looking at the same developments and then eventually comes to him to see whether he wants to serve on this committee, and he did. And that's why I have the files of the committee, because he saved it all and donated it to the university when he retired. So in terms of how I use Abbott's system here, I use it to talk about legitimacy, which is maybe the least interesting point, but this idea that a profession derives legitimacy from having it being taught or its content being taught at universities, right? There's a value to that. But I also talk about the university as a work site for interprofessional competition. And I think that's something we haven't done that much in accounting. So these accountants are competing with lawyers and in graduate school perhaps, but that's not a profession, but they compete with lawyers and medicine and so forth for the right students, right? So there's a competition there, even though they're not competing with their work, right? They're just competing for the right individuals, if you will. Okay. In terms of the tests themselves, I have about 700 tests that Asa Littleton saved, which, you know, there might be some confidentiality issues with that, who knows. But the test was issued initially in 1947. And I have the examination material, I have all the test booklets, I have the grading keys, I have the grades of all the students and so forth. And, you know, one of the questions I asked myself quite early on was, well, the least interesting answer to why we don't do aptitude tests in accounting could be, well, it didn't work. From what I can see, though, it seems to have worked. So the scores follow normal distribution, which is one of the requirements for having an aptitude test. They appear to measure aptitudes. I'll show you some of that in a second. And sort of, I had some of my research students locate the obituaries, if they could find them, of the 694 students that I have scores for. And I found about 30 of them.
4 minutes.
I have 4 minutes, that's perfect.
Yeah, okay.
So several of those have high scores and they really wrote to prominence. Arthur Wyatt and Vernon Zimmerman, I picked those because they're in the Accounting Hall of Fame, but that's sort of anecdotal evidence. So just very quick about the scores. Here, what I did was I just took all the 700 students and just sort of show you normal distribution, standard distribution. Here's the scores divided by years. You got your freshmen, your sophomore, your junior, and your seniors, and then you get some senior graduates and unclassified. And the argument I want to make here doesn't really come through on this page, perhaps, but the idea here is that you can see the curve shifting to the right as we get later in the year. So as we go from freshman to sophomore, sort of start shifting to the right, and then from sophomore to junior, it shifts further to the right. And the way we explain that in the paper, of course, is that this test is not testing accounting knowledge, but it is testing aptitude. And students presumably self-select out of accounting after freshman year if they don't want to, you know, if they don't have the right aptitude. So you would expect something like this. And here's just this is just me smoothing the results, right? I use a kernel smoothing mechanism, and I don't want to say anything about this other than just sort of compare the blue line to the senior and graduates, and you can sort of see how the curve sort of shifts to the right. So what I've done here is just I predicted the rest of the values based on the data that I have, and you can sort of see shift to the right. So it seems that this aptitude testing is picking up on something. So I don't really have time to talk about this, but very quickly, eventually we get about 300 institutions that do aptitude testing by the 1960s. And then the historical record doesn't really offer any answers to why it disappeared. But I pick up on what I think is the leading cause, and that's this sort of professional dominance in New York and this sort of inability to foresee the sort of issues that you might find in Missouri, Alabama, where they're not worried about the relative prestige of accounting and so forth. They're worried about just getting enough accountants. And I'll give you one quote here, and that might be a good way to end it. It says, and this is reported by Kerry, who was John Kerry, the secretary of the Institute. He says, to make any attempt either to restrict or to prevent individuals from entering a profession of their choosing, just because a psychiatrist or some such pretender to ability to diagnose vocational capabilities says so, is in my opinion un-American, an insult to the profession, smacks of regimentation, and possesses the seed in itself of great evil. So there's a lot of skepticism outside of New York for this program and sort of what it's trying to do. And the other two reasons that I pick up on the paper, and I'll end there, is sort of the end of the Second World War, right? Where men are returning from the European theater and many of them are entering accounting. And then we have Nisliso's sudden heart attack and death in 1950 as he was chairing the committee. So I have those as sort of your leading causes. I'll leave this and just sort of thank you. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm sorry I couldn't show you the video. I was very excited to show the video, but we'll make do. Let me stop sharing that. There we go.
Thank you very much, Martin. That sounds absolutely fascinating, and it sounds as though you've got an incredible archive to work through there as well. So, but anyway, I shan't say anything more at the moment. I'm going to invite Carolyn to act as discussant. Are you there, Carolyn? Yes, I can see you.
Alistair, I'm here. I can see you. I can't see Martin, but if I did that, yeah, perhaps I will. So, Martin, fantastic paper. Thank you. Really, really enjoyed it. Abbott and the AIA's aptitude test, fantastic. A very good description of the method, I thought, and all your archives and things that you drew on. And what else is available to other people who might be looking for information in that area. I wasn't sure that you brought out your quantitative analysis, like that's actually something to trumpet, and I think it's really good that you've got this mixed methods. And I mean, I knew they were there. I thought when I was reading the paper that someone else had done some standardization to check, and I hadn't realized it was you. And so I think that unless I read that bit too fast, you could bring that out a bit more. I think one of the really interesting things which you've already said about the paper is that the aptitude test is about enticing people into accounting. And I would just suggest that in a way that did mean that they kept people out. But I wondered what candidates thought when they failed. And I know you've said that they might, self-select out of accounting or not into accounting or something, but were they stopped if they had a poor aptitude from studying accounting? I'm going to do the interactive reviewer. So I don't know, Martin, if you want to make a comment about that, or shall I? I'll keep talking and then you can answer that later. The other thing which I don't think you had time to bring out is you talked about the funding of the testing and the fact that you have said tonight that you had the New York people and the other people, but the funding was really the crunch point, wasn't it? And that became the reason that they got excited about probably stopping it. So I think that is a strength of the paper as well, even though you didn't have time to talk about it tonight. The thing about Abbott and picking up on what you've got in the paper and picking up what you've said tonight, obviously I agree with you that Abbott talks about competition between the professions. Danielle McConville and Eliza Henderson and I have recently had a paper published in FAM where we talk about the expansion of accounting into charity. So the accountants moving into charity regulatory accounting in the UK, which is obviously different from the US regulation. And we've used that to show the expansion of jurisdiction. And in the small amount of words that you're allowed in FAM, we did do some straying into institutional work. And I just wondered if this was if that might be a little bit of a help to you in thinking about the expansion of the jurisdiction. I realize they're trying to plug gaps, but what we found was that there wasn't a lot of competition. No, like the lawyers weren't really that interested. The Big Four wasn't that interested, and yeah, so in fact, accounting has just sort of grown into that space. And with this idea of the public interest, and some of that might be able to, it might just give you some slightly different ideas, I guess. That was all I had to say. Really enjoyed the paper, and I'd really like to see the video.
I wish I could share the video. I feel absolutely terrible. I wonder, even after I fixed the presentation, the video didn't work. it's a wonderful thing. It's a bit archaic language-wise because it starts with a housewife filling out the house books, and then so say, well, you can do this as a profession too. So it's a bit of the time, but otherwise it's a great video. These are great comments. The mixed method, I'm glad you appreciated that. I think I hope there might be more to do there. I will say, I will admit that this paper started as something quite critical. Early on, I was drawing on the mismeasure of man, which is a book that looks at the history of standardized testing and just sort of the sort of ugly origins of standardized tests, or rather aptitude testing, coming out of eugenics and so forth. And I like that as sort of a theoretical angle, but it sort of runs out of steam, I think, because in the end, I don't know what these individuals were thinking, so I can only rely on what they said in their communication. There's very little evidence that was a connection that was clear to them. Ideally, I mean, you pose a real challenge in terms of what did the candidates do if they did very poorly? Like, did that actually dictate any decisions? Would they have stopped pursuing accounting? That's a good question.
Because you had two sets of accountants in effect. You had people studying accounting, and I think you had people who turned up to an accounting firm and they had a job and then they needed to study accounting. So I'm not sure if they were the same people, or if people just went off naturally to university and then thought, I'll study accounting. So I didn't know if they lost their job. You were silent about that. You seemed to suggest that it was going to upset them, but there was nothing specifically said what would happen.
That's it. I'm going to revisit the archive, see if I have something that they can offer some thoughts on that. And I like that. And yeah, I didn't do my presentation justice. So one thing that Carolyn picked up on, which I think is key, it's not just that the accountants are from New York City. The funding, and it's about $1 million that they raised in today's dollars to begin with. 95% of that came from New York, and 95% of that came from firms that were sort of within walking distance of the institute. So there's there's this sort of a real discrepancy, I think, with the experience of being an accountant in New York versus Missouri or Alabama or somewhere else in the Midwest or further down south. And I think there's something to be said about that, sort of offering more contextualized. I think I'm too broad in the conclusion right now, but I think there's something to be said about, can we really talk about the American accounting profession? Maybe that's a misnomer. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your comments, Carolyn. They're excellent.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carolyn, for your comments. Can I just open it up to general questions now, if I may? And I see, Richard, you've got your hand up if you'd like to unmute and if you've got a question. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Martin. Very interesting. The older I get, the more I realize I don't know anything. But the structure of the American profession, it's a bit more like it is here, isn't it? There are competing bodies of accountants. So here, the Scottish and the English institutes would want to distinguish themselves from the ACCA and the management accountants and the public sector accountants. In America, there's also different bodies of accountants, aren't there? So shouldn't an accounting aptitude test be something that just basically tells you whether you're the kind of guy who could bear to sit and look at numbers all day long? And of course, have the moral integrity to be work in the public good. Why just the AICPA?
In the sense why it fell to them, well, you had an AIPA, which becomes the institute. I'm thinking about what is the competition. I mean, it is stratified. Like, for instance, we have a unified CPA exam. The exam is unified, but it's administered by state boards, right? So you got the
that's the AICPA.
Right.
Other professional bodies of accountants, like we have management accountants, and we have the ubiquitous ACCA, and the. I mean, it's partly to do with the social structures, that the chartered accountants came from people who could afford to pay premiums to become trained, whereas like the ACCA was open to anybody.
Yeah.
So I always thought there were parallel things in America. Maybe I'm just wrong.
I think this. It had not even occurred to me that it might have been, some management organizations and so forth, and management accounting organizations that I'm sure those actually exist. Face value, I think there's some competition actually between sort of the academics and the institute. I can think of several instances where sort of what becomes the AAA comes out on the different side than the institute. But I have to come back and look at that actually and see exactly what the organizations are in place there other than the institute. I guess, and you know this, Richard, but like what I want to hammer home with this narrative though is that the institute in the 1940s is a much more consequential organization than it is today, right? Where it does more just sort of facilitating.
Same here.
Yeah. Mm.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. And that sounds as though that could be a very fruitful area of future research, because if the institute you're looking at was doing this, maybe some competitor institutes were doing something similar. Is there any one last question? We've got a minute left if anybody wants to ask anything else. If not, I was just going to say I was absolutely delighted to hear you mention the mismeasure of man, because as soon as
Karen got her hand up, Alistair.
Oh, sorry. It's not showing on my screen. Who's that?
Karen.
Me. Hello.
Oh, Karen.
Hello,
sorry, Karen.
Sorry.
You're not on my list for some reason. But anyway.
Absolutely fine. Don't worry at all.
I do apologise.
Mismeasurement of man. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you ever so much, Martin. Excellent presentation. Really, really interesting topic area. I just wondered how much the use of aptitude testing was happening elsewhere. How much there was a background or even a context of things going on with the professions and elsewhere, following on from aptitude testing being used in World War I and World War II, when it became very, very popular in the army. I just wondered how much of that was just a knock-on effect that the professions felt they had to do something similar.
I think that's a great question. I think that's something actually I can speak to. And I think that the more cynical story there is, of course, that we have a profession of educational psychologists who are looking for work. Ben Wood, who worked for the Educational Records Bureau, which is what the Institute turned to, had himself been on one of the committees for the Army's testing as well, which didn't come through my presentation. So I mean, Ben is clearly out there looking for work, and so is probably other educational psychologists. In terms of context, I mean, Yale, Harvard, and Columbia came together, I think, in the 1930s, and that's when they developed what becomes the LSAT. So there are developments around there, and the accountants are not, I think, you would have had the GRE before we had the aptitude test in accounting. Maybe not the GMAT, I have to go back and look at that, but at least the GRE would have been there too. So this certainly, and there's a professionalization story there too. I need to think about that, because that comes back to some of those things that Karen was saying about just sort of capturing this sort of expansion. I think there's a real story there. Yeah, thank you, Karen. I need to think about it more, but that's a good comment.
Maybe another paper.
Hopefully, we can get this thing out.
Thank you, Karen. Greg, did I see you had your hand up, or it's disappeared again now? I'm not sure what's happening to my screen.
I did briefly. And
oh yeah, just a quick one to finish then, if we can. Thank you.
I just wondered, to what extent might this have been a way of legitimizing some ways of making decisions over recruitment, and was it a proxy for doing things which were socially unacceptable at the time? The other thing that I would consider is, your graph moves to the right. That may be indoctrination as well as dropouts. Just as you learn to become towards an accountant. But anyway, they're just comments really.
Greg, I think it's not the story I want to tell, but I think that if you go back, like the mismeasure man makes that point, that sort of we have aptitude tests that are really testing sort of Western cultural understanding and is not capturing anything about aptitudes, and that you would be more indoctrinated after 4 years of college than after 1 year wouldn't surprise me. So that isn't an alternative story. It's not the story I want to tell currently, but I think that's very possible. Yeah. Thanks,
Okay,
Greg.
thank you very much, Greg. Thank you to you again, Martin. That's absolutely fascinating area. And I suppose one thing, I'm not expecting you to comment on it. One thing I was wondering is how sort of cultural specific the tests are to the 1940s, and what sort of results, if you got a few accounting academics to sit them today, that could be very interesting, couldn't it, to see how we score. But anyway, so there's a huge amount that we could carry on talking about, but I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed. Great paper, and if we can just show our appreciation, everyone. Thank you very much. That's the latest British Accounting Review, the special issue on history. Great. A very warm welcome. It's great to have you here with us. You are based at Trinity College, Dublin, and your topic is going to be early accounting thought in ancient Ceylon. So we really are doing a tour of the world today, which is great. So again, you've got 25 minutes to present. I'll just chip in about 5 minutes before, if that's okay, because I know what it's like once you start talking, isn't it? It's time goes past very quickly. Then we've got Darren Jubb has very kindly agreed to be the discussant for that one, and then we'll have 5 minutes of Q&A. Is that okay, Supun? Yeah, okay, just over to you then, whenever you're ready.
My name is Supun Chandrasena, and thank you very much, Alistair, for the kind introduction. I initiated this paper when I was doing my PhD studies in Trinity College, but recently I've joined Queen's University Belfast as an assistant professor. So anyway, I'll be presenting my working paper on the early accounting thought in ancient Ceylon and the prominent role of socio-cultural environment. Okay, so this is an outline of my presentation. Right, so before I start talking about my research work, I thought I would, to set the scene, I thought I would start by focusing on a poem written by Shriya Kumarasinghe. Beyond 1,000 years, somewhere in the faraway east, people had carved down stones, their earnings, taxes, and expenses. Lying long under the earth, quadrant pillars and slabs, saved and secured imprints, survived like gold and gems. So this is an extract of a conceptual poem written by Shriya Kumarasinghe under the title Accounting History, which was published in Accounting, Auditing and Accountability Journal in 2011. And in the introduction of this poem, she states that the purpose of this poem is to draw attention to the historical evidence of accounting practices in the ancient Asia. And she also states that although Sri Lanka has a history which is more than 2,600 years old, the significance of the archaeological findings in terms of accounting history has not been much investigated. So this motivated my study. So in essence, this paper seeks to explore the historical accounting practices that existed millennia ago, which were engraved in rock walls or formations in ancient Ceylon, which is presently known as Sri Lanka, a small Indian Ocean island close to the Indian subcontinent. So I have included an extract of the world map, and this country shaded here in red is Sri Lanka. So there is another important fact which I would like to draw your attention to before I proceed any further. This study recognizes accounting as a means of counting, measuring, and valuing objects, or in other words, as a means to quantify or value human activities, and also to ascertain modes of reciprocity and as an instrument for adjudicating economic and social claims. Also, this study explores the role of accounting as a tool in making human performances visible, or in other words, in accomplishing notions of accountability practices, both relating to the kingship and Buddhist monasteries. And finally, this paper goes back in time to the 1st or 2nd centuries AD and employs content analysis method to study the English translations of 122 lithic and other inscriptions during the period. Okay, so now I will focus on the research objectives. The objectives of this research is twofold. The first objective is to examine ancient accounting thought and practices mainly in two of the most important institutions in ancient Ceylon, which was the kingship and Buddhist monasteries. And the second objective of this research is to investigate the control environment, that is the political, economic, technological, and socio-cultural environment that underpinned the early accounting thought and practices, while placing special emphasis on socio-cultural factors that were largely inspired by Buddhism. Right, so I will now discuss about the research contribution. First of all, the current paper extends the current literature on accounting history and practices pertaining to ancient kingdoms and civilizations. Despite the existence of an age-old Indian treatise, namely Arthashastra, which was written by Kautilya, that explores on economic policy, statecraft, and military strategy, there has been very limited attempt to study ancient accounting practices in this region. There are some very limited prior work which has been carried out from a Sri Lankan context, but the focus of this limited prior work has been restricted to accounting and accountability practices in Buddhist monasteries. So therefore, the present study is different from the limited prior work which has been carried out in a Sri Lankan context, mainly because the current paper has a much broader focus, as it defines accounting practices as a means of quantifying or valuing human activity. And also the emphasis of the present study is not limited to Buddhist monasteries, but is extended to include other institutions such as the kingship. And also the current paper adopts a coherent and holistic research approach to study the ancient accounting practices and highlights the political, economic, and technological infrastructure that underpinned early accounting thought. And finally, but most importantly, we consider that this study is unique as it brings to the fore the influence of socio-cultural factors that prevailed during the ancient era in a Ceylonese context. Right, so I will now discuss about the literature review. So in my literature review, I have included some descriptions about ancient civilizations such as the Mesopotamia and Egypt, Europe, India, China, and South Asia. Precisely, I have discussed about token accounting, control and accountability practices in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and record-keeping practices and exchequer accounting system in Europe. And moving on to an Asian context, I have looked at the taxation system in ancient India and the cultural impact, or precisely the impact of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Feng Shui on early accounting thought in China. And in South Asian or in a Sri Lankan context, there was one paper which looks at how rock inscriptions were used as a tool in impression management by ancient kings in Sri Lanka. And also there are like a couple of papers on Buddhist temple accounting in early Sri Lanka. So for me, if I introduce the research site briefly, ancient Ceylon, which is presently known as Sri Lanka, is an island country situated in South Asia, located in the Indian Ocean to the southwest of the Bay of Bengal and to the southeast of the Arabian Sea. So Mahavamsa is one of the prominent chronicles written by a monk called Mahanama in Pali language in the 5th or 6th century AD. And according to Mahavamsa, Sri Lankan history traditionally started in the 6th century BC upon the arrival of the Indian prince Vijaya, who became the first king of the country, and ever since the island was ruled by approximately 186 kings. And the country remained free from any significant European influence until the 16th century, when the Portuguese managed to mainly occupy the coastal parts of the island in 1505. The dynastic history ended in 1815 when Sri Lanka became part of the British Empire. Right, so why did I choose this research site? Why did I use ancient Ceylon? Because there are a few reasons. First of all, Sri Lanka is geographically situated in a strategic location of the renowned maritime Silk Road. It was known to be a popular trade hub. As a result, it was known to be a popular trade hub. So therefore, we can assume that some form of calculated practices and modes of reciprocity were in use. And secondly, Ceylon has a documented history which spans over 2000 years. And Mahavamsa, one of the prominent chronicles of Sri Lanka, documents Ceylonese history from the 6th century BC. And among many artifacts, Ceylon's history has been documented through the use of rock inscriptions. So due to the availability of rich first-hand sources of information, was another reason for me to choose this research site. And finally, the existence of rock inscriptions and also prominent chronicles like Mahavamsa, which documents Ceylonese history from the 6th century BC, indicates that the art of writing had existed in ancient Ceylon. So this is again an important supplement of accounting practices. Right, so in this slide, I would like to distinguish Buddhist socio-cultural values which prevalent in ancient. For example, Buddhism teaches that people's endless desires are the root cause of suffering. So this promotes giving up or abandoning desires. However, this is different from the Western culture that values personal success and materialistic achievements. On the other hand, the religious arena in the West was an important constituent in early economic, commerce, and finance activities. But in contrast, Buddhist monks were restrained in engaging in commercial activities. Also, in Western societies, a higher emphasis was placed on written laws and contracts to protect individuals and society. However, in ancient Buddhist society, the concept of merit and demerit or karma largely acted as tools of self-regulation. So therefore, one prime purpose of this research is to examine how these distinctive socio-cultural values underpinned the early accounting thought in ancient Ceylon. Right, so this is the research methodology. This is, sorry, beg your pardon. So this is my research methodology. I have adopted archival method and I have mainly used primary data, so which includes lithic or other inscriptions. So in this slide, I have included some photographs of some lithic inscriptions. So these have been used as a means of mass media by the inhabitants of ancient Ceylon, and the ancients have used rock surfaces, but they have also used other mediums like clay, paper, and metals such as copper, gold, and silver. And inscriptions can be found in many languages, for example, early Brahmi, late Brahmi, transitional Brahmi, medieval Sinhala, and modern Sinhala. So this, the use of rock inscriptions can be used as an unobtrusive research strategy because they have been engraved during the reign of ancient kings and they have not been modified in any way. And finally, because this involves the oral or written testimony of eyewitnesses. And I have used relevance or purposive sampling for the purpose of this research. And the final sample includes 122 inscriptions over the time period from the 1st century AD to the 16th century AD, representing reigns of 32 kings over 7 different administrative capitals or kingdoms in ancient Ceylon. And I have used the manual content analysis method to analyze the data. So these are the coding categories and subcategories that have been used in the study, which are mainly inductive. And I'm now sharing some preliminary findings with you. So this map indicates a spatial distribution of inscriptions. So by looking at this map, we can see that a majority of the inscriptions, or 71, have been found in the North Central province. And this figure shows the distribution of inscriptions by king. And according to this figure, we can see that a majority of the inscriptions have been found in the era of this king, the King Dakula IV. And this figure indicates inscriptions analyzed by purpose. About 44% of the inscriptions record immunity grants. And finally, this figure shows a temporal distribution of inscriptions. So we can see that during the 9th to 11th century, a majority of inscriptions have recorded immunity grants, and whereas during the 1st to 3rd century, a majority of the inscriptions have recorded king's charitable acts. Right, so these are the results of the coding process. Okay, so now I will discuss about my main findings. So I'm using this figure, I'm using this framework to explain my findings based on the epigraphic evidence. So here I'm planning to discuss ancient accounting practices. Sorry, I'm planning to discuss the ancient accounting practices, mainly under kingship accounting and Buddhist temple accounting. And then I'm looking at the broader control environment that underpinned early accounting thought. And under the control environment, I'm looking at the political environment, the technological factors, and economic environment. And I give special emphasis on the socio-cultural factors. And epigraphic evidence suggests that socio-cultural factors have a direct impact on early accounting thought and also an indirect impact. Okay, so the indirect impact is where socio-cultural factors influence the political environment, the technological factors, and the economic environment, which in turn affects or which in turn underpins the early accounting thought. Right. So before I talk about the main findings, I will revisit my first research objective, which is to examine the existence of well-articulated forms of kingship accounting and Buddhist temple accounting in ancient Ceylon. Right, so these are some highlights of the key findings. Under the kingship accounting practices, epigraphic evidence suggests that various types of taxes, for example, customs tax, land consumption, irrigation, police tax, and toll duties have existed, and also that various types of state expenditure have existed. And also, epigraphic evidence suggests that there have existed 2 royal treasuries. And also, epigraphic evidence discusses about the existence of the accounting profession. And these kingship accounting practices have occurred mainly to keep track of king's wealth. And in terms of Buddhist temple accounting, epigraphic evidence suggests that the ancients have maintained proper records on inflows and outflows of resources. And also they have calculated the balance of income, which is left after expenses, and they have retained them as non-transferable goods, mainly because Buddhist monks were prohibited to engage in endeavors with profit motive. And finally, they have prepared periodic accounting records, and they have read them out loud in an assembly of monks and other lay officials. Right, so now I will revisit my second research objective, which is to investigate the control environment that underpinned the early accounting thought and practices, while placing special emphasis on socio-cultural factors that were largely inspired by Buddhism. Right, so to talk about the control environment, these are some highlights of the key findings. So under the control environment, I'll first talk about the political environment. So under the political environment, the epigraphic evidence suggests that a feudal system existed where the king owned all the land. The Mars had to recompense the king for consuming the land. It was unfeasible for the king to access geographically dispersed masses, so therefore, administration was decentralized. This gave rise to accounting practices by way of record-keeping activities to fulfill the accountability of the crown's delegates towards the king. So under the economic environment, agriculture was the main livelihood, which involved land measurement and grain measurement. That implies that some calculative practices were in use. The economic environment also included trade activities. And further, a primitive banking system existed, which not only accepted grain, but also money, which also implies that the ancients were aware of the two concepts, capital and interest. Under the technological influences, the presence of rock inscriptions that are centuries old evinces that the art of writing had existed in ancient Ceylon centuries ago. The oldest inscription in Ceylon dates back to the late 3rd to early 2nd century BC. Under the numerical technology, although we do not have enough evidence to comprehend the method of calculating taxes, dues, or imposts, it can be argued that a systematic method existed in the calculating, checking, and recording of the royal income. And as explained above, a system of land measurement and grain measurement have existed. Historical records have revealed that coinage was in existence in ancient Ceylon, which is again an important supplement of accounting.
Supan, you've got about 4 minutes left, if that's okay.
Oh yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will quickly explain about the socio-cultural factors. So this slide discusses about the socio-cultural factors that compelled accounting practices to be undertaken in Buddhist monasteries, for which I refer to as the direct impact. So ever since the introduction of Buddhism to Ceylon in the 3rd century BC, it received royal patronage at all times. So this resulted with kings donating substantial amount of wealth along with immunities to monasteries. And also this resulted with accumulation of wealth in monasteries, which finally resulted with misappropriation of funds. So according to Buddhist philosophies, monks were prohibited from wealth management activities, and openness and accountability were crucial in Buddhist monasteries. So therefore, to safeguard the reputation of monks, to remain trustworthy, and to maintain a good relationship with the king and the general masses, proper recording of monastic funds and periodic public reading of the same was, critical. And finally, Buddhist teachings does not allow for business and profit desire, especially for the monks. So therefore, temple accounting system operated with a non-profit motive. So in this slide, I explain how socio-cultural factors that were strongly influenced by Buddhism impacted the political, economic, and technological landscape in ancient Ceylon. For example, under the political environment, it was believed that the ruler should be the custodian of the sacred tooth relic of Buddha, and also the king was considered as the official protector of Buddhism, and there existed a basic framework of Buddhist ethics for rulers known as 10 royal precepts of kingship, and sound value. There existed a sound value system and cultural and religious controls to safeguard sound principal-agent relationship. So if I quickly show you some examples of religious and cultural controls, most of the inscriptions included a carving of a dog and a crow. So, just this is very interesting. So I would quickly explain what this symbolizes. So this symbolizes that if any person misappropriates monastic funds, they would be born as either a dog or a crow in their next lifetime. And also, this sentence here, like most of the inscriptions also included sentences like any violators will be born as crows, dogs, or as village pigs, or the beasts of the hill. And some sentences, there were some sentences in inscriptions which say that violators shall take upon themselves the sins committed by all the inhabitants of the land. So unfortunately, due to the time constraint, I think I would leave it there. If I come back to the economic landscape, cultural practices and customs dominated the agricultural activities, and there were Buddhist principles on right livelihood. So therefore, trading in certain goods and services were made, they were prohibited. And finally, this is how socio-cultural factors influenced the technological landscape. Buddhist monks became an important group in the literate society. So therefore, a Buddhist education system originated in the country, where Buddhist monks were engaged in disseminating knowledge beyond the spiritual domain to followers of Buddhism. Right, so finally, I believe that this research is significant because history contributes to contemporary research in policymaking and practice and in standard setting. And finally, studies on history also inform us about how we have reached a consensus on certain issues at present. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention and participation. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them up now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. Sorry, I can hear an echo. Can anyone else hear an echo, or has it disappeared? No, I'll take it as not. Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. Because my own work is in sort of Western monasticism, I'm going to be very good and not pull rank and immediately start talking to you about it. But I shall invite Darren Jubb, who's very kindly agreed to be the discussant for this paper.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed that. I think I enjoyed reading the paper as well. It's a fantastic discussion of the development of early accounting thought, and I thought you're using really interesting data to tell a really engaging story, or rather stories, because I think there's a few different stories being told in the paper, and that's something I'll talk about more in a moment. A few quick comments. I've got a list of comments which I can send to you after, or we can discuss it by email. But I know there's various people within the workshop today who can offer comments and questions that will be extremely valuable to you. So I don't want to take up too much time. The first thing was to do with the paper specifically. Was it was a good read, but it was, it's very long. It's over 17,000 words in the main body at the moment, and I think that's something to look at, because at some point in the sort of second half of the paper, I think it starts to lose a bit of focus, and you start to sort of lose the reader a little bit. So hopefully you can take on board some of the comments and suggestions from today, and look at ways to reduce that. And I think that relates to the other main point, which is that you're trying to do quite a lot in the paper. You're covering a large period of time from the 1st century to the 16th century. You're trying to document accounting and non-accounting practices in an ancient period, whilst you're looking at the cultural, the socio-economic, the political, the technological landscape. And I think all of those ideas in one kind of contribute to the paper sort of losing focus. So I think it could be that there's 2 papers there, and that if you go back to your objectives and aims and really work on refining those, you might be able to tell a couple of more concise stories there. And that comes through as you're trying to comment on the sort of Cremona and Esamel stuff on accountability, and then you're bringing in the stuff that Jones did on control environment, and there's not really any explanation of how that works together. And I think by the time that you've worked yourself through all of those different concepts and explained that in relation to your fantastic data, I think that's maybe where the paper loses a little bit of its value later on. So I think that was the main thing that came out of it when I read it. And then the one main sort of question I had at the moment, as I say, I've got more that I can send you after, was more to do with your data. And there's been a handful or a couple of studies in this area, and I was wondering if you could say how your data, apart from it being over a longer period of time, how does it differ from, or what have you done differently with it? What story have you told that's different from the work of the likes of Gregory, Lee Anarch, and stuff? Because some of the quotes that you use in your paper are the same quotes that they use in their papers. And I was just wondering if you could say, what do you think looking at that data again in a different way offers to us?
Yes, so I think I tried to talk about it in the presentation, but I didn't have much time to explain that in detail. So what I've tried, how I have made my paper different from, there are 2 prior papers by Leonaracci. So the focus of those 2 papers were mainly on Buddhist temple accounting, only on Buddhist temple accounting. So in my paper, I'm looking at both temple accounting and the accounting practices that were undertaken in the kingship. And also I'm trying to embed this in the broader control environment, while placing special emphasis on the socio-cultural impact that prevailed during that ancient Ceylon. So that is how I try to distinguish my paper from the prior work. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, as I say, I've got some stuff that I can send you after, but I'll let other people comment and ask questions then.
All right. Thank you very much for your valuable comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Darren, for that. Can I open to the floor now and invite any other questions or comments on accounting in ancient Sri Lanka or ancient Ceylon? Richard, I can see you've got your hand up. Can I invite you first? Are you there, Richard?
Thanks very much, and thank you, Super, very interesting to add to our collection of knowledge about ancient practices. I'm not quite sure how to formulate this. I guess you could say you're looking at Buddhism as an institution which has temples and practices and arrangements for, sometimes on the television it looks as though every small boy in one of those countries is a monk. So there's the institutional aspect of how the Buddhism works, but there's also the religious aspect of what is the philosophy of Buddhism. How does that make a difference to what you think is important? And that's where I always have a problem. I don't know much about other religions, but if you look at Christianity, well, Alistair can join in on this when necessary. I mean, the monks all have a philosophy, and or the whole of Christianity has a philosophy that the love of money is the root of all evil. It doesn't stop you being very successful, profit-making individuals and corporations. So there's a lot of casuistry which allows you to do things which apparently your religion prohibits you from doing. Islam, similarly, with usury, all sorts of tricks for writing contracts that avoid actually explicitly including interest. But nevertheless, you still manage to make profitable investments. So with Buddhism, how do you get round the religion and actually get on with doing what most people, I'm afraid, seem to want to do, which is have a good life?
That's a very interesting observation, that a comment and a question. I would say, so yes, you're right. I'm actually looking at Buddhism as both an institution and as a philosophy, like, when I was doing this paper. So I am not quite sure whether I'm really trying to answer your question, but so yes, Buddhist philosophies actually prohibit profit making and, engaging in commercial activities, but that is mainly for Buddhist monks. So that is that relationship. I'm trying to identify that as the direct impact of socio-cultural impact on early accounting thought, because when I go through inscriptions, it definitely it specifically says that the surplus, that is the balance of income, should be retained as a reserve. So the monks were not they were like prohibited from using that funds in, like, in obtaining other assets, in purchasing other resources. So they were kept separately as a reserve, because the monks were prohibited from engaging in commercial activities. So I take your point. Yes, I understand. So did I answer your question, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure there is an answer. But, I mean, just by well, Alistair will correct me, no doubt, but take the English monasteries.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the monks have to live in poverty, chastity, and obedience, and quite a lot of them didn't do any of those things. And by the time of the Reformation, the biggest source of new revenue for the king was expropriating the wealth accumulated in the monasteries. So the moral prohibitions, I mean, we're all guilty of this. We all think we should be good, but a lot of the time we aren't. I think Alistair ought to.
Yeah, I'm just hovering, Richard. If I can interrupt, I think there's some really interesting comparisons to be made between what's happening in Ceylon, in Buddhist monasteries, and ones in medieval Europe. The first thing I suppose I'd emphasize is that there is supposed to be a distinction, I use the word supposed, between the monastery as an institution and the monks as individuals within it. And just as you said, Supan, that the monastery was encouraged to retain reserves for itself, that they weren't to be, shared out in amongst the monks in riotous living. It was the same in Western Europe, in that the wealth of the monastery wasn't seen as belonging to the monks. It was seen as belonging, in the case of Durham, to not just God but to St Cuthbert as well. And you have this constant sort of battle of reform and monks who do embrace poverty, and then it becomes a nice, safe lifestyle, and you get the wrong. I mean, maybe we should have had some of Martin's aptitude tests in there as well. You get the people who are coming in for a nice, cozy life, and discipline slacks off, and then you get a new reform movement. So there is this tension the whole time between, you know, the individual who's supposed to be leading an ascetic life, and the fact that the more ascetic they are and the harder they work their land, the more money they're actually going to generate. And, you know, it's trying to avoid them using that. So I don't want to hog the conversation, but I think there are very interesting parallels. And, you know, I'd be interested in taking it a bit further forward. You know, at the start, you sort of make a contrast between Buddhist civilization and rejecting the values of the world, so to speak, which are more widely embraced in the West. But at the same time, I'd say, you know, asceticism, withdrawal, that's been an ongoing theme, you know, for 2,000 years in the West as well. So I think there's a lot of useful comparisons to be made. Sorry, Richard or Supan, do either of you want to come back on any of that at all?
No, I think that's fine. But I mean, I've been to Buddhist temples in China and Singapore, and you just give money to the monks to read prayers for you. So where does all the money go?
Well, it's a bit like buying my mind has gone blank, but buying, you know, the remission of your sins, isn't it?
Indulgences, yeah.
Indulgences, that's what I'm looking for. Yes, yeah. How do you feel about that, Supan? Are you okay with those comments?
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much for the very interesting,
we must have a further chat. Sorry, I mustn't hog this. Is anybody else? Let me just see if anybody else has got any questions or got their hands up. Nobody else at the moment. Well, we're just about.
Very quickly.
Yeah.
Obviously, Sri Lanka is very close to India, and you said a major historical event was the arrival of the Indians in 6th century BC. So how different is what goes on in Sri Lanka from what goes on in the mainland Indian continent, where presumably you also have Buddhism and Hinduism and all the others competing as religions, and the accounting that is associated with those institutions. So is Sri Lanka different from India?
Again, that's a very interesting observation. I wouldn't say Sri Lanka is very different from India. It's actually very similar, but like, you know, when I went through inscriptions and some other secondary sources, some other secondary historical records, there are some aspects which talks about, okay, so this particular aspect, for example, the primitive banking system. So there are some evidences of a deposit banking system even in South India, but the time periods are not like, you know, not simultaneous. They were like slightly different. So there are some aspects which I would say are unique, but like most of the aspects, they are like, you know, very, very similar to India. But in my paper, I'm only looking at the Sri Lankan context. But yes, you're right. It would be interesting to compare this with, you know, the closest neighbor with the Indian context as well.
There is some literature about India that's about, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. We can carry on talking, but we better end it officially there for people who've got to go at 11ish. Thank you very much, Supan. That was a fascinating paper, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing a lot more about it and to discussing it more with you. Can we all just show our appreciation? Thank you very much indeed. So again, can I just, sort of summarizing, just say thank you very much indeed to our 3 lots of presenters. We had Jingmei Zhu from Nanjing University, Luca from Bologna, Martin from University of Illinois, and finally Supan from now Queen's University Belfast. We've had 3 fascinating topics, so thank you very much. Thank you to the 3 discussants, Takeshi, Carolyn and Darren as well. We do appreciate what you do in looking at those papers. Can I just remind you all that our next virtual workshop is scheduled for Tuesday, the 11th of May, 9 to 11, and we'll be circulating programs for that shortly. 2 other events for your diaries. We are hoping, we had to cancel our accounting history review conference at the end of June, but we will be having a smaller virtual event 24th, 25th of June this year. And Karen, I can't remember the date offhand for the accounting history conference. I think, have I got the 8th of September? Is that right in my head, or is it
22.
Sorry?
22.
You're doing a short virtual one.
Oh yes, yes.
Yeah,
Apologies.
sorry,
yes, there is a virtual one. It's the 9th.
9th
September.
or the day out. I do apologize. So if you could put those in the diaries, that would be great. And finally, just thank you very much to everyone for attending today. It's lovely to see you. And I must say, I just feel as though I've got out. One of our presenters was saying, they felt very restricted, even though they live in a beautiful country. And I feel as though I've just seen, 3 completely different periods and completely different parts of the world. So on a personal note, I'd like to thank you very much, because we are stuck at home and we all feel as though we've had a day out almost. So thank you. Alan or Karen, anybody else want to add anything else to the concluding remarks? Can I just say a big thank you to Alan and Karen and Matt as well for all the organisation and putting everything together they do for this. They do put a lot of work in behind the scenes. So thank you to you 3 as well.
No, thank
you, Alistair. Yeah.
And anything else that we should highlight at the moment, Alan?
No, I don't.
Karen or Matt?
It was shown a little bits about the latest issue of British Accounting Review is the Accounting History SIG special issue on accounting history. That's well worth a look at. The editorial is very, very good. So are the papers. So anyway, I'll pass it back to you, Alistair.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, if your copy of the British Accounting Review comes to home as mine does, it was great because I received it last week and it does look a fascinating issue. So do look out for that. Anybody else like to make any comments, suggestions for how we do things in the future? Any thoughts? Or just have a general chat about what the weather's like? Or
can the papers be made available? I mean, obviously the presenters and the discussants have seen them, but we only get the presentation, and there's obviously a lot of historical detail in them, which one might not be interested in all of them, but some of them one might have a dig around before the event.
I think that's a very good suggestion. It's when we haven't actually asked the presenters if they would allow us to do that. I mean, I think what we could do now at the moment is if anyone wants any of the papers and they would prefer to go through us rather than straight to the presenters, any of us would be happy to act as a conduit for contacting the authors and getting the papers to people. We'll try and add that into future events, Richard, because I think it's a very good suggestion, just making the papers available. Alistair?
Yeah, I'd agree with that, because I mean there are lots of things from the 3 papers today. I think, oh, I'd just like to look at this or investigate that. So yeah, if we can do that, I think that would be excellent. I suppose we just have to think about people don't want to be, until they've submitted, they perhaps don't want to be quoted from it. But you could ask permission first.
Yeah, Karen's put her email address into the chat, presumably to act as that conduit, I think.
Yeah. And I suppose that's a good point about just trying to contact each other. It's more difficult nowadays with data protection because we can't just send a list of emails out, can we, to everybody to say these are the folk who are here, and if you want to get in touch, please do.
You can Google them and find out.
Yes, yeah.